We also have Chaco Media House. We received news that our senior political leadership society will not make it due to logistic challenges. But the debate will go on as planned. The panelists have been split into two groups. Each group has 4 members. They are from different programs and different years, but all from past society. Before I start everything, I would like to brief you on the history. The past society started debates in 2020. The aim of the debates is to develop our skills learned in different courses. This is the 3rd debate. The debates tackle different cross-cutting issues. For example, as this one is looking at what should economic development, at what cost should economic development be obtained. This is the goal of the debate as to whether Malawi should experience rapid development at the expense of certain liberties by adopting a developmental state model. This topic is challenging, but at the same time interesting to listen to. So I hope by the end of the debate, you will choose a side. That being said, I would like to set a few ground rules. Please switch off your phones, or you can put them on silent so that we don't disturb the debate. Keep your voices down, avoid booing, but you can clap where necessary. We have the protocol team, and if they direct you to do something, please comply. Thanks for listening to me, but before I leave, I would like to give the floor to Prof. Chasugwa to give few remarks. Prof. Chasugwa.
Good evening, everyone. Yes, so welcome to this event. As already indicated by the MC, we are here to witness the debate which has to do with the developmental state in Malawi. Which way should we go? Should we think of engaging the framework of developmental state? Probably we shouldn't go that way for the reasons that we are going to hear from our panelists. This is the event that the department has always supported because we believe that as an institution of higher learning, we have to be sharing ideas. So we go in class for the theory, but we also believe that students should be given a platform for them to engage with the concepts that we do learn in class, but also improve the skills. So through the debates, our conviction is that students can improve their argumentation skills, research skills, because in the process of debating, you should have done some research. And therefore, the debates that are organized and supported by the past department, we feel they are so important. We are happy that this is the event that is always student-led. So it's the Political and Administrative Society, Political and Administrative Studies Society that has organized this event, and it has also organized the other 2 events that have been held before. This is commendable because students are also trying to display their skills in terms of organization. How do we go about events management, which are some of the skills that would always want to impart on the students. So to the organizing committee and the whole past society executive, I know old and new, congratulations for organizing this event. Probably they deserve a hand, yeah? Okay, So we are so eager to listen to the arguments that are going to be put forward by our panelists. And again, thank you so much. We know it takes a lot, guys, to be in front, get organized. We heard that CU hasn't made it because of logistics, but the society moved around so quickly, came in so fast to reorganize the whole thing. So that we should have the debate. So for the to the panelists, we thank you for that. Let's enjoy the evening. Thank you.
And now I have the moderator to introduce the topic, and the panelists will also introduce themselves. Then the debate will commence.
Good evening, everybody. Our role this evening is twofold. We are to moderate because of a few changes that happened last minute. We are also to judge. And so we take those two roles humbly. And hopefully we are going to enjoy taking two roles as we listen to the debate, as we participate in the debate, and as both teams put on a good fight. So the topic this evening is, should Malawi experience rapid development at the expense of certain liberties by adopting a developmental state model? Should Malawi experience rapid development at the expense of certain liberties by adopting a developmental state model? We have proposers and we have opposers who have promised us that they are going to put a gallant fight. Let me, at this point, invite the proposers, starting off with the chief proposer, to introduce himself or herself and the rest of their team to do the same. Chief proposer and your team, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ronjesu Sibweza, and I am the chief proposer for the debate.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jane Chibisa, and I'm one of the proposers.
I am Mamgo Wataini, and I'm one of the proposers.
I am Annie Mzumara, and I'm one of the proposers.
Thank you. That's the proposers. Can we hear who the opposers are this evening? Chief opposer and your team.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Pavo, and I'm the chief proposer.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tarandra Maulidi, and I am one of the opposers.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Piwe Togo Yasini P, and I'm one of the opposers.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Ndolo, and I'm one of the opposers.
Can we give both teams a very serious round of applause, please? Thank you very much. Let the battle begin. Let the debate begin. gloves are off, and therefore taking the podium would be the chief proposer. The chief proposer is going to present his argument or his team's argument, and that will be followed by the chief opposer's presentation of the argument on behalf of his team. Chief opposer, I suggest you take a maximum of 7 minutes. So you have 7 minutes within which to make your chief argument. The floor is yours.
Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen. As earlier introduced, Lonjezo Sibweza, the chief opposer. Did you know that in 1990, Malawi was ranked number 138 of the 178 poor countries across the world? And in 2006, Malawi was again ranked 166 of the 178 poorest countries in the world. And now recently, in 2021, Malawi has been ranked 172 out of the 178 poorest countries in the world. What does this tell us? This definitely implies, or this is a reflective of the stagnant development. Now, what is development? Historically, development has been primarily on the economic process measured by how much a country and its people produce in a year. And this has been popularized to be termed as GDP. Now, according to Chinsinga has actually described the economic development trends that Malawi has actually undergone. So he has actually split the trends into actually two folds. The first fold, it's actually between the attainment of independence in 1964 to the late 1970s, where we see the government actually manipulating wage policies, manipulating agricultural price and subsidization policies, labor laws and monetary policies, what have you. And this economic development trend was actually characterized by economic booms and busts. This trend was actually popularly called as the state-driven economy. And now in the second trend, he actually postulates the second trend started in 1981, where Malawi adopted the structural adjustment programs, where the structural adjustment programs advocated for a free market and no state interventions. And this particular trend was actually characterized by the eventual decline in the quality of life of individuals, to the extent that households were actually sleeping on empty stomachs. Now, what does this tell us? This definitely tells us that if the state actually intervenes in the livelihood of individuals, then it can actually the country can actually attain development. As such, we call upon for Malawi to adopt a developmental state model. Now, what is a developmental state model? So in essence, a developmental state model is a state that majorly attempts to deploy its administrative and political resources to the task of economic development. And again, in a developmental state, it is actually characterized that the ideologies that is actually placed behind the actors within this particular state and the structure itself actually have to be compatible to the extent that they actually have to occupy and support this particular state. And this developmental state is also characterized it is also characterized in terms of its legitimacy. Legitimacy of the government is actually derived from to the extent at which leaders retain development. So, as it is popularly called that there's actually no free meal, attainment of development involves certain trade-offs that actually have to be made. And for instance, you're actually trading off your time. You could have been performing other particular activities, but you're actually here. So the same way, to attain development, you must actually make trade-offs between some liberties. Now, why are we saying that? We're saying that because some liberties are costly to economic development. For instance, resources, monetary or human personnel, which would have been diverted to economic development, are used in the restitution or otherwise the construction or the repair of damaged infrastructure due to massive demonstrations. For instance, The Nation newspaper reports that an average of $534.8 million was actually estimated as the damage which was caused due to the Gen Answer demonstrations. And to that particular end, in 2020, we see that the Karonga District Commission was actually destroyed merely because teachers were actually demanding raises. And again, power alterations in democracy destabilizes the government actions in attaining economic development. Mkandawile asserts that this particular problem is actually in twofold. In the first fold, it is merely about implementation. Implementation becomes problematic when she asserts that the 5 years which the government is given is actually not enough for a government to actually attain development, nor to engage in developmental initiatives. And again, the transition of different governments distorts the root of economic development. And again, she actually postulates that this leads to the inconsistency between developments when politicians are coming in power. And in the second fold, she actually explains that most politicians, when actually coming into power, they have what she termed short-terminism. Now, what does she imply when she actually says short-terminism? When she says short-terminism, she implies that when the politicians are actually coming in power, their visions are of the short term and not of the long term. So what does this basically imply? So basically, it implies that whenever politicians are actually in power, they actually just give us or make promises that actually their ends in the short run. For example, the Moody Transformation Trust itself, which was actually which took place for about a year and a half. Thirdly, the need for consensus and the need for consensus of interest makes democracy, in this particular case, the guarantee of all liberties, resource consuming, and it delays the attainment of economic development. It is difficult to reach a point where all interests in the society are aligned to accomplish developmental goals, especially where some individuals are at a stake where they can actually lose within this particular process. And again, elite support through democratic mechanisms is difficult to attain. As such, we call upon for the adoption of a developmental state. The developmental state in this particular regard will actually lead to the creation of environment that majorly supports development. For instance, we can talk about the creation of an investor-friendly environment, in that the state actually mobilizes resources and directs them towards the realization of economic development. And Chauhan, a lecturer at Pennsylvania, he actually postulates that in a democratic in a democratic state, the government actually initiates in the engagement of strategic investment initiatives, as opposed to our Malawian democratic system, where we see that the majority of the poor make or introduce policies.
Thank you.
That
okay. Your time is up.
Okay, thank you.
A hand to the chief proposer, please. Let me now invite the chief opposer to make use of his 7 minutes in presenting his argument on behalf of his team. Chief opposer, your time starts now.
Good evening, everyone. Once again, my name is Blessings Mpako, and I'm the chief opposer. Our group, we are of the view that development should not be attained at the cost of certain liberties. In our argument, we define development by de Blassier's definition, who defines development as the improvement in the quality of life. Now let me not beat around the bush, let's get straight to the serious business. Why should development not happen at the cost of certain liberties? Firstly, the definition of development has changed. It is very backwards and primitive to only define development in economic terms. Development should include social conditions change, which not limited to this, can include eradication of poverty and reduction of the gap between the rich and the poor. Those who define development as economic growth, they assume that wealth will spontaneously trickle down to the lower class. But this has not been the case, and we have all witnessed it. Wealth remains at the top. And without the proper social institutions to check this, where the gap between the rich and the poor will keep on increasing. As such, development should not be attained at the cost of certain liberties. Secondly, rights are indivisible. You cannot accord a hierarchy to rights that this type of right is superior to this one just because you deem it so. All the types of rights have equal status. As such, they should all be provided as a bundle in the set of rights itself than removing other rights just because you want to attain development. Thirdly, by attaining development, by sidelining other liberties, will incite resentment from the masses. To attain the democratic state that we are enjoying presently, a high price was paid. Blood was shed, a lot of people went into exile, and a lot of people stayed behind jail just for us to have this democratic state that we have at present. Now, if we were to remove the rights and the freedoms that were paid the price for, this would be spitting in the graves of the heroes who are dead and in the face of the heroes who are still alive. And it will incite the civil unrest that we have already witnessed. As such, development should not happen at the cost of certain liberties. Also, if we were to copy the institutions of other states who have developed that way, there will be failure in transfer of institutions. According to the impossibility theory by Dr. Charity Musamba, a Zambian political scientist, she states that African states will not attain a developmental state by copying the institutions that the Eastern Asian countries used to attain their developmental state. This is because institutions are contextual. We should consider the present conditions we are in now, which is a global economy, and those who developed, the Asian tigers developed in the 1970s, which was during the Cold War and also the post-World War conditions. And as Malawi, we cannot recreate those conditions. Except let's prioritize on the conditions which we have presently and develop a developmentalism mindset so that we develop. Lastly, Malawi cannot develop by sidelining certain liberties because of the influence of the present democracy. Know that a political ideology is something that takes long to be indoctrinated into the minds of the masses. And for development to be successful, the whole country has to have the same mindset. And you will all agree with me that the present generation, it has been taught the mindset of democracy, the mindset of a free nation. Now, authoritarianism might seem attractive just because other countries developed that way, but then remember that authoritarianism is not only limited to development, it also affects the society, social relations. As such, we should not develop by sidelining other liberties. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Chief Opposer. Can we now give a round of applause to both the opposers and the proposers? The session that follows would require that members of both teams participate. So minus the chief proposer and chief opposer, each of their members would have to respond to a question. When we ask a question, the member from one team would respond to that question, and then the question will then cross the floor to the other team for an opposing member to respond to. So the first question will be asked to the person sitting next to the chief. And the same question will have to be addressed by the person sitting next to the chief on the other side. I will take the first question, and Dr. Gunde will take the second question. I will take the third question. So my question will first go to the proposers. And here is it. The democratic model for development has frustrated development in Malawi. The democratic model for development has frustrated development in Malawi. What is your take? You have 2 minutes to respond to that question before it crosses the floor to the member of the opposing team. Take to the podium. Your 2 minutes start now.
Thank you, the moderator. From our point of view, we are to agree that yes, the democratic model has frustrated development in Malawi, in the sense that democracy, as the chief proposer already proposed, it delays development processes. In the way that to reach a consensus whereby everybody is agreeing to the policy that is to be implemented, it takes a lot of resources, including time and human resources as well, even money, for them to reach the people who are in the village to agree to the policy. And not only that, a democratic model of development is a contradiction to a development state, of which its attainment is very impossible, because the government now has to act as the watchman by watching the people exercise their rights freely at the expense of development, which is very much frustrating to the economy of Malawi. And as you can see, most of the development processes are delayed due to democracy rules, because democracy allows that everyone has to agree with what is supposed to be done. So, for example, you see how the democracy provides freedom for people to go against some policies. In the sense, we're delaying the policies to be implemented. So I think really democratic model frustrates the development in Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you. Then let the member sitting next to the chief opposer respond to the question. I'll ask it again. The democratic model for development has frustrated development in Malawi. What is your take? The democratic model for development has frustrated development in Malawi. What is your take? Your 2 minutes begin now.
From our point of view, the democratic model has not frustrated development in Malawi. This is because of the view that we had a high price to pay for democracy. So therefore, just ignoring democracy would get in the way of the economy. As Wade M. Cole said, when people's bodily rights are protected, they participate in the economy. So since our Malawian society gives respect to democracy, people are freely able to participate in economic activities, which does not frustrate developmental activities because everybody has liberties. We can give an example of the private ownership of rights, which is a liberty that Malawians have and is part of the democratic model. This helps everybody to be able to take part because they may be able to own their own property and develop their own businesses, hence being able to develop our Malawian state. Thank you.
Thank you, both teams. The second question will go to the third in line, and to start from the team that is the proposing team. After I give out the question, I will repeat it so that it's for clarity's sake. And then this is the question: should the state curtail freedoms of people that are anti-developmental in pursuance of development? Should the state curtail freedoms of people that are anti-development in pursuance of development? Should the state curtail freedoms of people that are anti-development in pursuance of development?
Okay, thank you very much. This side, we are of the view that actually, if we are to curtail freedom, there should be a threshold, or there should be a threshold that is going to be used to curtail those freedoms. So if there are people that are anti-developmental in the state, actually what the state has to do in that particular instance is to check whether the individual is actually impeding democracy. We are actually arguing for a arguing for a developmental state that is actually promoting the principle of developmentalism. So if anybody is actually impeding that goal, then the state in that instance can then intervene to curtail that freedom, because we want to pursue development. So we have the view that if it's curtailing freedoms, it's not just about curtailing freedoms per se, but it's actually trying to gauge what is what the person is actually trying to achieve by doing that. If it's frustrating the developmental agenda, then yes, the state is justified.
Then this question will go to the opposing team. Should the state curtail freedoms of people that are anti-developmental in pursuance of development?
Okay. Answering your question, I would like to start by asking a few questions. Okay, the first question is, what is a democracy? When we define a democracy, we are talking about a state that is for the majority of the people. It is for the people. And when you talk about other people being anti-developmental, it does not make sense, because every citizen wants the development of the country. When we talk about development, we are talking about social development, we are talking about political, economic. Every citizen wants to be developmental. So my answer is no, don't take any freedoms of anyone, whether they are for anti-developmental or whether they are developmental. As we already said, for us to get democracy, for us to get the liberties, we struggled for them, we fought for them. It does not make sense to take any liberties from anyone. It's not fair, there is no equality. So I'm saying is, let us develop as a democracy. Let Malawi be a democratic developmental country, but don't take any freedoms from anybody. Thank you.
Thank you, both teams. I'll take it back to the moderator. Okay.
Thank you. I'll take the third question. And therefore, I'll start with a member from the opposing team. Developmental state is not contradictory to democracy. Hence, it is wrong to say people have to choose either development or democracy when using developmental state framework to achieve development. So that's a statement. I'll repeat it. Developmental state is not contradictory to democracy. Hence, it is wrong to say people have to choose either development or democracy when using developmental state framework to achieve development. What is your stand? Again, in 2 minutes.
Thank you. A developmental state is really not in some ways contradictory to democracy or development because it aims at developmentalism. But now the question of discussion is, should it be experienced at the expense of certain liberties? We know that it is very difficult, and this has never been the case in the past, to transfer the rules that other countries are employing in their countries for development to take place at a rapid rate. So we are of the view that developmental state does not really contradict to democracy, but if we are to take off some liberties, that means we will be wrong, as it is very difficult to transfer institutions or rules or policies from other countries, as they will have to be adapting to our context here in the country, Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you. The member from the proposers team, I'll ask the question again for you. Developmental state is not contradictory to democracy, hence it is wrong to say people have to choose either development or democracy when using developmental state framework to achieve development. Developmental state is not contradictory to democracy, hence it is wrong to say people have to choose either development or democracy when using developmental state framework to achieve development. What is your stand? Your 2 minutes begin now.
Well, thank you for the question. In the first place, when we are adopting a developmental state, we are not transferring the rules and the policies of other countries into our country. Rather, we're going to use what exactly we have in a country in order to enforce development activities. And at the expense of liberty, well, democracy talks of the freedom that a country has to give to the people, right? And it limits the powers of the state itself. But then, some of the liberties impede development in a sense that, for example, the demonstrations that are conducted, usually people, yes, express freedom, but what exactly does it do to development? It leads us back. So, in a developmental state, the state intervenes in economic activities. It regulates or rather controls some of the liberties or freedoms or rights that really hinders development in a country. As such, when we're talking about democracy and a developmental state at the same time, it is contradictory in a sense that you cannot expect the state to be a watchman, to just watch the people do what exactly they feel like, and at the very same time expecting the very same state to intervene. No, people have to choose one thing. If it is for development, they really have to go for development other than the liberties and freedoms. And to what use exactly is it that a person should be free to do whatsoever they have to do at the expense of them sleeping on empty stomachs? Development is there to ensure that the livelihood of the people is adhered to. Development is there to provide employment to the people, making them to earn something else that they can provide for their lives.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. The topic for debate this evening is, should Malawi experience rapid development at the expense of certain liberties by adopting a developmental state model? while we have all been made aware of the developmental state model, I'm sure many of us would love to hear what these certain liberties are. Let me invite the chief opposer, followed by the chief proposer, to tell us their understanding of what these certain liberties are. Chief opposer, in 1 minute.
Okay. Developmental state can be defined in two perspectives, according to the ideology and according to its institutions. The ideology of a developmental state is that everyone has to aim at developing. The mindset of the people have to have a common goal of developing. And in institutional terms, it's about its political and its social structure. It should have a strong social structure, which includes its bureaucracy and also those who check the power, which are the media and the civil societies. And also its political structure, which means the political leaders should have legitimacy. They should be in position allowed by the people. Thank you.
Thank you. Chief Proposer, 1 minute.
Thank you for the question. It is my understanding that the question was actually concerning liberties and not developmental states. And again, the way we have defined liberties in our particular context, liberties shall mean freedoms which will potentially or expediently improve the quality of life of people. And in this particular regard, we have actually defined freedoms because there's actually not a non-record of freedoms. They've actually not been documented. They've only been documented in form of rights. So basically, we mean, when we talk about liberty, we have transposed that meaning to mean rights to private ownership, rights to mean economic rights, to mean all the positive rights. So in this particular regard, we're defining positive rights as those rights in which the government should actually do something, or the government should not do something so that these rights should be realized. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. That marks the end of this particular segment. So the program will pan out as follows. We shall have a recess. Suggesting that we break for some 10 minutes, where both teams can catch up some fresh air and take a sip of water. And the judges can also confer. And the rest of the audience can think about the questions that they'll have to ask. When we return from recess, there will be a rebuttal by both chiefs. That will be followed by a question and answer session. The questions have to come from the audience. No longer the judges, but the audience will have to ask questions based on what has been presented so far. And so, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to suggest that we break now. Take a break, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. The next session will be a rebuttal. And so I will again invite the two chiefs. We will start with the chief opposer, followed by the chief proposer. Each one of them is allocated 7.5 minutes to make their case. Chief opposer, please take to the floor And your time begins now.
Thank you. Firstly, let me cite what they continued repeating, and that was defining development as only confined to economic development. People also need to improve in other sectors of life. That is a narrow view to have on development and as intellectuals. Also, they recited the 1960s to the 1980s era as there was a good time for development. They cited the 1960s to the 1980s era as it was the best time for development. But then I'll quote something that the elderly usually say. They say, "Ukapita kuchipatala sumafuna kubwerako." Why? Because in the hospitals they were providing food, and people wanted to stay there just to eat food, because at home the government wasn't allowing them to produce what they want and also the amount which they want, because the government imposed quotas. And also the land laws, by then it was not, everyone was not guaranteed that everyone can buy land. It was mainly favored to the estates. As such, we cannot cite such a thing as development where we are enjoying staying in hospital just because they are food, but let's allow those at home to make their own enough food so that they should enjoy staying home. And also, at the very first definition, they defined development as GDP. GDP is not a good measure of development. The GDP understates social conditions of a country, and also it does not consider the distribution of resources. If the people being productive are only 2 people in a country of 100, the GDP will still say that this country is developing. But in real sense, is that country developing? And also, they said, and I'm quoting them again, they said, to develop, we have to consider what we have, which is a repetition of what we said. Institutions are contextual. As such, we have to consider the present state of Malawi. We have to consider the present state of Malawi, that it is development, and prioritize, it is democratic, it is a free country. As such, we have to prioritize on that so that we develop. And also, the other issue is in the removing of the liberties themselves. What criteria will be there so that you should choose which liberties should be removed? And also, well, let's say you've done it and then development has happened. What guarantee is there that the future leaders will now retain those liberties which you removed? What is the guarantee that the future leaders will retain them when they were profiting from their absence and violating the very basis of human rights? Lastly, by comparing the numbers of the ranking of Malawi is a big joke. How can you say we were 130 and we were better off? That is the same as saying that, oh, at least my child has gotten 45 points. He's still not going to university, but is better off. Your child has 54 points. It is still a failure. As such, let's look to the future so that we develop. Thank you.
Okay, are you done? Okay, thank you. A big hand to the Chief Oposer. Let me now invite to the floor the Chief Proposer to give us his team's rebuttal. You have, again, 7.5 minutes within which to do that. The floor is yours. Your time starts now.
Thank you for the question, for the opportunity to speak. Okay, so you said, and I quote, the developmental state model negatively affects the social life of people. So basically, you were basing that particular conclusion on the premise that it actually takes away certain rights. But in essence, a developmental state actually just regulates those particular rights. And in a developmental state, we're arguing for a state that actually emphasizes that the rights should be paired with obligations. So the first question would be, as to what extent is that conclusion true? And again, you defined development, and you encompassed a lot of aspects: political, social, cultural. So the question which I would actually ask is that when you talk about development, what do you mostly identify with? You know, when we talk about development, each one of us here to ask a person, what is development? They'll actually say development is all about how much wealth a country has, or something like that. And then in this particular context, I would actually pose a question basing from your definition of development. How do you measure sociological development, or political development, or cultural development? What threshold is there to determine that a country has indeed politically developed? If you say that we actually measure this particular development as to the extent at which people actually are controlling the affairs that affect them, then it would actually have to be, non-intellectual for us all. And again, focusing on the theoretical concepts of development, there's actually no threshold to actually determine that this is the level of political development, or this is what constitutes political development in general. Therefore, in contrast to that, we have the economic development, which is which has a historic narrative. And on top of that, you have talked about participation. You have talked that participation leads to economic development. So basically, the question would be, as to what extent is that applicable in Malawi? To what extent have we seen that participation has indeed led to development? Have we really developed since adopting democracy in Malawi? Have we? We can see that we have not. We've actually just been circling around the same point, or human rights, or protection of human rights. And again, the quality of policies which actually Malawians actually make, are they reflective of the participation itself? And again, in the same context of participation would actually, in the context of democracy, would actually mean that the majority of people would actually have to have a greater say than, those of the minority. But then, in this particular regard, are you trying to say that the 51% of Malawians should take away the rights of the 49 Malawians if the 51% have actually agreed that yes, they indeed should? That's food for thought. You should reflect on that. And again, you have talked about a high price to pay for democracy. I agree with you, yes. We have indeed paid a high price to attain democracy in Malawi. We've actually strived to attain independence. But then the question now comes, how relevant is this to the subject right now? We can see that in as much as we fought hard for independence, there are our ancestors who fought for that. We did not. They've actually died. Sure, we call them heroes, or term them heroes. We have to respect that. We have to respect that, yes, that is actually true. But to what extent would you agree with the proposition that you must sleep on an empty stomach merely because someone else fought for independence in the past? Does that actually make sense as an intellectual? I bet it does not. And again, on the same, should we say that, yes, we've indeed suffered for democracy, we have, but the question still stands: how is that relevant to the concept of democracy, of development right now? So with those few questions, I think I should rest the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to both chiefs, chief opposer and chief proposer. We in the audience have heard your argument. We in the audience have questions to ask. We in the audience would like to hear what you have to say about what we think with regards to the topic under discussion. The next session, ladies and gentlemen, is the audience time. So members of the audience have to ask questions that will be taken by both parties, the opposers and the proposers. So this is how we are going to do it. I will recognize 3 gentlemen and 3 ladies to start with. And let me say this before before I recognize you. You have to ask a question, okay? The tendency is for people to go round and round and round and round and then ask a question, having consumed 5 minutes. If you can't come up with a clear question, I'll cut you and go to the next person. So the first set will come from this side. Abwana Emilirani. Abo Emilirani. 2 gentlemen. Any ladies this side? Okay, fine. Abwana Emilirani. Abwana Emilirani. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the next round of questions will come from this side, and I'll only take ladies from this side. So you can only sit down after you ask your question. We'll start. Where's the mic? So we'll start from here. Very direct. Ask your question and sit down.
Development is indeed diverse, that it has changed its meaning, such that what we call development might be termed no longer to be development.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Ask the question.
I want to ask.
No preamble. Ask the question.
Yes. Okay. So, considering that most of the nations which have used development state applied the dictatorship as one of the tools for them to develop. So, how are we going to do it in our context now? Because one of the principles for you to learn a developmental state is that you need to use dictatorship. So how are we going to do that in our context?
Okay, thank you. So ayambe ndani kuyankha bwana. A big. Ayambe ndani kuyankha. You want the proposers to start or the opposers to start?
I think the opposers to
Okay.
start.
Any member of the team can volunteer to respond to that. And therefore, address the question in 2 minutes.
Okay, so the question is addressing the fact that in order to have a developmental state, we should have dictatorship, right? But then when we look at the Malawian context now, if we develop dictatorship now, do you think that people will accept it? Maybe I should just get out of Malawi and use an example of an outside country. We have the instance of Singapore and Taiwan, which were democratic countries which decided to develop an authoritarian developmental state model. And when they developed this in the 1960s, it worked, yes, for some time. But because of pressure from the people, because the country was democratic in nature before, they had to switch back to becoming a democratic state. So, if we adopt this in Malawi, how long do you think that the government will be able to avoid the pressure from the people? Will the people be happy with this being developed? So we should just use what we have presently, which is democracy, in order to develop a developmental state model that everybody can align with. Thank you.
Opposers, in 2 minutes, any member from that team?
First of all, I think you should understand that developmental state is different from an authoritarian state. because in a developmental state, Alright, so in a developmental state, you're not having a dictator. You have a small group of elite people who are responsible for decision making and for controlling the policies that are being made in the government. And not only that, you also have a bureaucratic system. The bureaucratic system is there to provide checks and balances. It's not like the leaders are only accountable to their leadership only. And in a developmental state, you also have a constitution which you have to follow, which this can also prevent them from developing into a dictatorship state. In a way that, in a developmental state, legitimacy is based on the performance of the government. So if the government is not performing well, that means it loses its legitimacy. And obviously, they're not going to proceed with the government. So I think it's very much possible to prevent a dictatorship system of government in a developmental state. Because in a developmental state, we are only concentrating on the government controlling policies that affect the economic development in that state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Second question from here. Go straight to the question.
On what grounds do you believe that trading off liberties will bring a positive impact in our economy? On the basis that liberty is a key idea to economic development. This is based on Friedman and John Locke's writing.
Okay, thank you. Let the proposers start. Any member of that team, and you have 1 minute within which to address that. And your minute begins now.
So, in essence, a developmental state does not necessarily say that there should be no liberties, but merely regulating that these particular liberties are supposed to be paired with these particular obligations. And in the same lane, you should actually bear in mind that development is a precondition of democracy. As such, you cannot actually the prospects of attaining a democracy in a poor country are so invalid to the extent that it begs the question as to what will you be actually sharing. Let's give an example. Democracy argues for equality. It begs the question as to what resources are you going to be sharing if you don't actually have resources. Basically, development is a precondition of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Opposers, any member from that team, and your 1 minute begins now.
I would like to answer. There is no guarantee. If we do not have democracy, we cannot develop because we already have democratic institutions, firstly. And secondly, they talked about being a developmental state does not require you taking off the rights. You're only deciding which rights are you going to take off. But then how do we define which rights are we going to take off from the individual? Because we already say the rights are indivisible. And also instead of us focusing on our economy, we should be defining which rights we are going to take off from the individual. It does not make sense. So I'd rather say that I agree with Mill and Locke. Yes, we are in a social contract, but then let's not take off the rights because there's no guarantee for development. Thank you.
Thank you. Question number 3 will have to come from that end. You go straight to the question, please, no preamble.
I am Augustine. Individuals trade off to achieve, families trade off to achieve excellency. Why not a country? First question. Second question.
Sorry, one question. Thank you. Members of the opposing team, opposers, a member from your team, address that question, please. I'll repeat that for you. Individuals trade off, families trade off, why not a country? So 1 minute for you to handle that question, and your minute starts now.
Okay, I think the real issue here should be what is worth trading off. I think in the Malawian context, we are better if we trade off the weak policies. We are better if we trade off political interests. Those are the things which we should trade off, not human rights. So in the trading off for development, let's consider the real issues which are impeding on trading off, and those are the things which we should forego so that we develop. Thank you.
Thank you. Proposers, any member of your team in within 1 minute. And your minute starts now.
Okay. I want to say this. I want to agree with you. Individuals trade off. Families trade off. Even the government should also trade off some liberties that are impeding development. Even the government should also trade off those liberties that are actually impeding development. It's not true that we should be sleeping on an empty stomach just because in the name of liberty. Let's be serious, guys. This is developmental. This is a development that we are talking about. This is a state. Okay, yeah. So think of those times that the government wants to.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you have. I'll give you 10 seconds to make your argument.
Okay, think of those times that the government wants to proceed with developmental agenda, and then people are just impeding it. There have been instances where, because of their liberties, the government has actually imposed COVID rules, and then people go to the courts to obtain an injunction. Yet those COVID rules were there to protect lives of people.
Thank you. Question number 4.
Okay, there is an assertion that development prevails or flourishes in privileged environments like the USA and the Western democratic countries. Would you justify the feasibility of development in poor countries or least developed countries like Malawi, where institutions are not well developed and structures are not well developed too? Thank you.
The opposers, any member of the team, to take that one in within 1 minute. Which minute starts now?
May he repeat the question, please? It wasn't clear.
What is the feasibility of democracy in developing countries or least developed countries?
Okay, in democracy, with the proper use of human resource, there can be development, because it will be the development which is driven through the people, starting from a micro level, as everyone is being encouraged to participate in the democratic, in the developmental process. And this can only be done, and the people will only be willing to do this if they are free in a society. But without other freedoms being given to them, that means there would not be development, as the people will not be willing to participate in the development process. Thank you.
Thank you. Proposers, your 1 minute starts now.
All right. When we're talking about development can be very possible in a country, be it a developmental country, because the state itself intervenes in economic activities. It will employ or take necessary policy measures that will induce or drive that country towards achieving the developmental agendas. This is so because, for example, the creation of a friendly investment environment makes it possible for investors to come into a country and invest. In a country, okay, for example, in a democratic country, there is a lot of corruption going on. And the other thing is, because people usually go into power just so as they can develop themselves other than developing the country itself. So if we can to take the developmental state, definitely we will only be focusing
Thank you.
on achieving
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Question number 5.
Okay, thank you. Okay. My question is clear. I'm simply quoting the word on the topic that we have, at the expense of certain liberties. Now, the question is, we are arguing here about, adopting a developmental state model, but then we are not specifying what are the liberties that we are talking about. So my question is to those the participants, in front of us, what is the liberty we are arguing here, so that maybe we should be in the same line with what proposing.
Thank you. We start with the proposers in 1 minute. Proposers, your 1 minute starts now.
Alright, so the certain liberties that we are saying we should experience rapid development at the expense of, we're talking of certain liberties that impede development. And these kind of liberties include the right to private ownership of property, right to economic freedom. Why so? Because in a developmental state, it's the government which takes control of the economic activities that are happening in the country. And in a sense whereby there is the right to private ownership, the government does not really take off the right to private ownership, but it controls the private industries as well. So it's not a matter of really taking off the rights, but controlling the rights.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Opposers, your 1 minute begins now.
Okay, in the first place, let me thank them for being in concordance with us that they are not taking off some liberties, as the team has said just recently. According to Chama Johnson, in the year 1892, the one who coined the phrase of developmental state postulates that a developmental state does not have to sideline some liberties. So that's really a question of interest to say, what are these liberties? If they say, okay, the right to economic or private ownership, it is as good as telling you are not the owner of the phone that you have. That is not development. That's why we say the development does not have to be limited only to economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Question number 6.
My question goes straight to Blessings Mpako. Blessings Mpako, you said that when defining development, we must not define it in economic terms. What is the economic definition of development? And also, you said that when defining development, we must include poverty approaches. Does economics sideline poverty approaches? Thank you.
Okay. This question goes, as the audience member said, it goes to Blessings Mpago, and therefore after Blessings Mpago answers it, the counterpart on the other end will answer that question. Over to you in 1 minute.
Okay, let me first say that you misheard us. Development, we did not say development should not include economic growth, but it should not end at economic growth, but it should also encompass social conditions, which are the quality of life, the things which you are free to engage in. So that's how we defined development, not only limited to economic growth, but also encompassing the social and political arenas of life. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if the chief opposer would want to take that one as well. So if you do, then your minute starts now.
Well, I actually agree with you. Poverty translates into the stagnation of the economy itself. Therefore, poverty must also, when you talk about poverty, we must also include the economic sense of poverty. You cannot explain poverty without explaining the economic sense. And again, a point of correction to my fellow team, to my opposers. A developmental state strives to strike a balance between economic development and social development by mobilizing resources and reallocating resources to meet intended goals of development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. That was our first set of questions from my right-hand side. The second set of questions will come from my left-hand side, and let me recognize 6 ladies. This is a ladies' 10. I said that at the start. So 1, 2. Any ladies, please? So if you could stand up, stand up. Okay. Any ladies from this side? Okay, so we have questions. We have questions from 2 ladies. They have forgone the other 4 slots, and so maybe they'll help us save time.
Okay, so my question is, how is the invisible hand that was adopted for development here in Malawi and other countries helping us in our context to develop?
Okay, thank you. Let's start with the proposers, and then we'll move on to the opposers in 1 minute. Any member of the proposing team?
Okay, that is actually a very good question. Let me commend you for that. So the invisible hand actually played a greater role as postulated by Chinsinga 2007, where he was actually analyzing the 2005 and 2006 fertilizer subsidy program. And in this particular program, he actually postulates that it is actually when the state actually engages in actually controlling all the aspects of the economy to the extent that the free hand itself should not actually play a greater role in determining the economy of a country. In that if the economy is left to operate on its own, it will eventually crash, and requiring the government to actually, engage in fixing it. And therefore, in that particular regard, it is fair to assume, it's actually fair to assume that indeed government must intervene so that we must prevent these future crashes. Thank you.
Thank you. Opposers in 1 minute, and your minute starts now.
An invisible hand advocates for free market and also advocates for participation of each and every citizen in that country to get social optimal results. So for us to sideline the liberties of those people who will be the same people participating in a free market, it is like creating a zone that in this case the market should not operate. So the free hand helps us because there is free participation for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Question number 2.
Especially to the proposers, I would like to understand to what expense are you willing to sacrifice the Malawian culture, especially on the limitation of these liberties that you're going to break or close concerning the culture, especially there's been other international donors, maybe they can say want to donate some funds, and by the amount of that funds, yes, it's really going to promote development in Malawi, but then maybe they're bringing a condition of like such funds should be aimed at it's going to come in rather at the expense of LGBT rights. So are you willing to sacrifice the reputation of Malawi that has always been there? Are you willing to sacrifice the reputation of Malawian culture at the expense of these rights if they are going to break the sexual reputation that has always been there in Malawi?
Okay, thank you. Proposers, you have 1 minute, which starts now.
Okay. Well, it doesn't mean that a developmental state will eventually allow for any conditions that international agencies and whatnot, or in the name of donor aid, to take course in Malawi. No. We have seen it during Bingo's era, right? A lot of international agencies were trying to bring in some of the conditions that were not in line with what exactly Malawi wanted. But did that really reduce economic growth? It didn't. But still during Bingo's era, right, the economy itself boosted to some level. It is because he denied other conditions that were there imposed by the donor agencies. So it is very possible for us not to allow just any conditions for the sake of donor aid. We can still employ some of the measures and the smooth and good mobilization of resources.
The minute is
by
over.
directing
Thank
them
you.
to the right channel.
Thank you. Opposers, your minute begins now.
I would like to answer that we cannot have a developmental country while ignoring culture, because Malawians, we value our culture firstly. Secondly, even if when we talk about the local government, we are always talking about the local government being democratic, while there are still chiefs who are still persisting in the councils, because we value culture. We can talk about the sustainable development goals. We can talk about the MGDS. We can talk about the African Union of 2063, the Malawi Vision 2063. They all talk about emphasizing a culture-friendly culture in Malawi. So we cannot talk about development without culture. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so very much. That ends this segment. The next segment is where the two chiefs are making their closing arguments, their final argument. So I'm going to give each of the chiefs 5 minutes within which to make their final, hopefully convincing argument on the position that they have taken with regards to this evening's debate. The chief proposer will start, to be followed by the chief opposer. Your 5 minutes, chief, has started.
I have to correct something which has been greatly misinformed. Okay, so basically a developmental state aims at striking a balance between economic development and social development by mobilizing resources and actually diverting them towards a particular end, which is often development. And yes, while I have to agree with my opposers, rights are indeed indivisible. You can say that one right supersedes the other. But then that's not what we're advocating for. We're not advocating to say that these rights should actually be given the most primary concern. No, we're merely saying that there are some particular rights which have to be regulated. They have to be controlled because they actually harm to economic development. And my opposers, they've actually claimed that adopting a developmental state model will bring resentment to the people of Malawi. So basically there'll be internal resistance to the model. And again, they've actually claimed that the transfer of institutions is actually contextual. While I have to agree that yes, the transfer of institutions is actually contextual, I would actually have to raise questions as to the resentment part. And all these particular issues can be resolved by the ideologies of Malawians. It is actually true that indeed when you give Malawians something that which they can actually point, for instance food, roads or infrastructure, you can see them that, they can actually applaud the government for its initiatives. So basically, in a sense, legitimacy of the Malawian government is actually based on the initiatives that the government actually employs. Therefore, if we employ a developmental state model, the fact that, or the prospects of having resentment from the people, it's highly unlikely. And they've actually postulated that transfer of institutions is actually contextual. And yes, I have to agree with that. And with that particular point in mind, I would also like to point out that while we're actually transferring institutions, while we're adopting this particular model, we would actually have to tailor it to fit into the Malawian narrative. So with those few remarks, I hereby stand and conclude by saying that Malawi should indeed adopt a developmental state model at the expense of certain liberties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was the chief opposer. Sorry, chief proposer. Let the chief opposer take to the podium in 5 minutes.
Okay, I think someone should call the English teacher because this team doesn't know the meaning of a conclusion. So, we say that as we are discussing about issues that affect the country, I think we should be discussing the real issues that are really affecting us. Those are issues like corruption, a weak bureaucracy, and we should not be punishing people for these wrongs that have been done and are not really connected to the issue of their liberties. Let's take into consideration only the real issues. And also, let's move away from creating a strong leader, but then we should create a strong political institutions. The meaning of institutions is rules of the game. Let's change into creating strong rules in the politics arena, which can include creating the political parties which have a strong ideology, creating of strong election rules, and also strong political coalitions. Before I conclude, let me say, if any of you want to see the paper for this debate, you can approach me or any of my members and we'll give you that paper. But let me leave you with a quote from a Nobel laureate, an economist who received the Nobel Prize, Amartya Sen, who said, "Development should not, as an end in itself, only involve economic growth, but should also encompass our social life." Now, this is the best part, and also the freedoms we enjoy. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. That was the chief opposer. Can we give both teams a massive round of applause, please? So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be handing over the mic shortly to the MC. So that I can confer with my fellow judge on which team has won. But before I do so, let me indicate here that in terms of what we are looking at as judges, our scorecard was interested in a number of things. So for example, we are looking at the argument. In the argument, we are looking at how logically was it flowing. We are looking at whether the teams were able to provide supporting evidence. We are looking at clarity of the expressions, and we are looking at their time management. So will simply say this team has won and this team hasn't won for today. There's no losing team. It's a team winning and a team not winning. So there are differences in that. And so let me hand over the mic to the MC, who will be taking us through the closing remarks while we're conferring. And then we'll pass on the judgment or the decision to, I don't know whether I'll pass that to the head of department or someone else. So thank you so much. Over to you, MC.
Thank you very much. That was a debate. So now I would call the president of Pass Society to give the closing remarks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy. Actually, I am very happy. We have had a debate. It has been very great. First of all, let me thank our patron, Dr. Michael Jasukwa, and the whole PASS department. They have made sure that we have been fully funded and we have been timely funded. This is great, our department. A hand for him, please. Let me also thank our judges who have also been our moderators. They have done it very well. The flow has been very great, and the whole debate process, we can see that has been very great. As well, let me also recognize the presence of Mrs. Maulidi. Yeah, she's here with us. Madam, you are welcome here. Let me also thank my fellow executive members, the PASS Society Executive and the debate committee. You have done a very great job organizing this debate. In spite that CU let us down, they did not come, but then we have had this debate. It was just short time, but then we have had it. And lastly, let me thank you, the audience. You have been a very, very nice audience. I understand the audience is not only for PASS students. I can see that we have the full support from the whole University of Malawi, because I can see science students here, I can see education students here. I'm very happy that you came here to support us, and this is very great. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you for the hand for the president. Now we just have to wait for the judges to tell us who the winner is and who the one who did not win. Yeah, we don't have this.
Yeah, so as we are waiting for fellow judge to compile or to do the totals, let me say that we also enjoyed the debate. You know, some of us are quite lay people. Those of you that know us, I'm simply an industrial and organizational psychologist and is in the language and communications department. So the concept of developmental state or development or democracy, they're not as alien to us, but probably the lens with which we use to understand and appreciate those would be different. So for example, if you come to me, I will tell you that maybe development is in the mind. It's not even in the institutions that we talk about. It's not even in the infrastructure that we talk about. You know, you come across people that, as students of political science and development and politics, you think they are poor. You ask them whether they are poor, they tell you that we're okay, we're happy. Because the lens that they use to describe their state of affairs are different from yours. Yeah? Other countries have said, okay, maybe this issue about GDP is nonsense. Why don't you look at quality of life? Why don't you look at happiness index? Yeah? Because what you call development, maybe it doesn't make sense to some of them. I'm not saying what you're saying, what you're laying is useless. And so it's amazing how people have come to this point in our state of COVID pandemic. When you look around, you'd think COVID never existed. Yeah? And I can count people that are putting on masks. And I thought COVID has changed the way we behave as people, and therefore we could be more cautious of whom we are sitting next to. How sure are we that the guy sitting next to us is not COVID positive? But that's an area in behavior change. And so maybe it's part of us getting used to COVID. So it's okay, we can live with it any way we want. Okay, now here's the moment where the trophy must go. The trophy must go. I don't know, I'll ask my fellow judge to present the trophy to the winning team. Before I do so, let me appreciate the fact that both teams chose probably their best chief. Both members of the panels were quite forceful in presenting their argument. We as judges, we have to say that it was difficult to score some of the areas, but the area that we found easier to score was when it came to the issue of rights or liberties. I think because the two teams were quite miles apart in terms of presenting the argument around issues of liberties. Which liberties should be forgone, which liberties should be maintained, and stuff like those. So let me ask Judge Gunde to lift the trophy. And let me, Judge Gunde, let's go up the stage. Let me invite both chiefs. Let me invite both chiefs to stand. And so, ladies and gentlemen, may I therefore ask the chief proposer to take his seat. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the opposers have won this evening. Okay, thank you. Congratulations.
This marks the end of the debate. Can we give a round of applause for our winners? So before we leave, because we opened with a prayer, may we also close with a prayer. Charles.
Shall we bow our heads in prayer? Father, we thank you for being with us. We thank you for leading us throughout this function. Father, we thank you for keeping us away from all sorts of distortions, who have been a cooperative audience and leaders. Lord, we ask that may you guide us as we'll be heading back to our places of residence. It is night and we need your guidance so that we are safe and we travel safely. Through Christ our Lord, I pray, amen.